There is a sound. Almost every American has heard their whole life and long ago stopped hearing. It rises on a spring afternoon, that low mechanical wail climbing over the rooftops, and you glance up from the lawnmower, or you turn the radio down for half a second, and then you go right back to what you were doing, because it is almost always nothing. The sky is a little dark. It's a test, maybe. A storm that will slide off to the north and never touch you. You have heard that siren 100 times, and 100 times it has meant nothing at all. So somewhere along the way, without ever once deciding to, you taught yourself that it means nothing now. That lesson, the quiet one that says the warning is just weather, just noise, just the same false alarm as always, is the most dangerous thing in this entire story. Because on the evening of May 22, 2011, in a city tucked into the southwest corner of Missouri, everything that was supposed to work worked. The forecast was right. The watch came hours early. The warning came with time to spare. The sirens sounded across the whole city, and 158 people died anyway. This is the story of how that could happen, and of the strange, deeply uncomfortable thing that investigators found when they went looking for the reason. Because the answer was not in the sky. It wasn't a failure of radar or science or the men and women who watched the storm form and did their jobs exactly right. The answer was hidden in the narrow gap between the moment a warning is given and the moment a human being decides to believe it. And what came out of the ruins of Joplin, Missouri, changed the literal words this country now uses to tell you that your life is in danger. Words that may be sitting inside the emergency alert on the phone in your pocket at this very moment. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of person who wants to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. And I want to know one thing while you're here. Where are you watching from, and does your town still run the tornado sirens? Drop it in the comments. Now let's get into it. Joplin is not a city that thinks of itself as fragile. It sits at the edge of tornado country in a state where spring storms are so routine that the warnings themselves become part of the background hum of the season. The people there had heard it all before. They had watched the green-black skies build in the west 1,000 times, felt the air go still and heavy, and gone on with their afternoons. May 22, 2011 was a Sunday like that. Hot, humid. The kind of oppressive stillness that anyone raised in the Midwest reads without thinking. Families were finishing an ordinary spring weekend, and they were doing it less than a month after the country had watched, in horror, the April 27th super outbreak tear across Alabama and the Deep South and kill more than 250 people in a single day. The danger was not abstract that spring. It was fresh. And the system did its job. Early that afternoon at 1:30, the Storm Prediction Center placed southwest Missouri under a tornado watch, in effect for hours. The forecasters in the Springfield office watched the supercell build and rotate. At 5:17 in the evening, they issued the tornado warning, a full 17 minutes before the funnel ever touched the ground west of the city. 17 minutes is a lifetime in a tornado warning. It is the difference, on paper, between a near miss and a massacre. The sirens went up across Joplin. On paper, everyone in that city had time. At about 5:34, the tornado came down out of the wall cloud on the southwestern edge of town, and within minutes it did something rare and merciless. It grew. Not into the thin rope funnel most people picture, but into a wedge nearly a mile wide, a wall of wind so broad that from the ground it didn't even read as a tornado. It read as a darkness. It was later rated EF5, the highest rating that exists, with winds estimated above 200 miles per hour. And it did not race through. It ground its way across the southern half of the city at only about 20 miles per hour, slow and deliberate, staying on the ground for roughly 38 minutes and 22 miles. A faster storm gives you a glancing blow. This one took its time. It went straight through the heart of Joplin. It shattered St. John's Regional Medical Center, one of the city's 2 hospitals, hard enough to move it off its foundation and blow the medical records for miles. It flattened neighborhoods so completely that survivors couldn't find the streets they had lived on their entire lives, because there was nothing left standing to navigate by. When it finally lifted, it had damaged around 8,000 buildings and destroyed more than 4,000 homes. It injured over 1,000 people, and it killed 158, a toll that would climb past 160 in the following weeks as some of the injured died of their wounds. It was the deadliest single tornado to strike the United States in nearly 60 years, since a twister leveled part of Flint, Michigan back in 1953. And here is where the story turns into something more than a disaster. Because this was not a storm that struck in the dark with no warning. This was a warned tornado. The forecast was accurate. The watch was early. The warning was on time. The siren sounded. When federal investigators later wrote up their assessment, they concluded the National Weather Service had performed, in their words, in an exemplary manner. Everything the science was capable of doing, it did. So the question that hung over Joplin was one that should terrify anyone who lives under those sirens. If the system worked perfectly, if the warning did everything a warning is supposed to do, then why were 158 people dead? To find out, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration sent a team into the wreckage. They walked the debris fields. They interviewed more than 100 people, survivors, first responders, city officials. And the thing they came back with was not a story about the weather. It was a story about the mind, about the invisible, very human machinery that sits between hearing an alarm and actually moving your body toward safety. And what they found reads, in places, almost like a confession from an entire city. The majority of the Joplin residents they surveyed did not go to shelter when they heard that first siren. They heard it, and they waited. They did what the report described in careful bureaucratic language as seeking additional confirmation. In plain English, they didn't believe it yet. Not because they were reckless, but because they had been trained not to. For years, Joplin's sirens had gone off for storms that fizzled, for weather that passed, for warnings that came to nothing. Researchers have a name for what that does to people. They call it warning fatigue, or the cry wolf effect. Every false alarm you live through quietly erodes your trust in the next one. And Joplin, by that spring, had been crying wolf for years. So when the real wolf finally came, the town's first instinct was the one it had practiced 1,000 times. It's probably nothing. Let me check. And so people checked. They turned on the television and waited for the anchor to tell them it was serious. They stepped out onto the porch to see the sky for themselves. They called family. They waited for the tornado to become real to them in some way the siren alone never could. Investigators found that most people didn't act on the warning itself. They acted only after they got what the report called a non-routine extraordinary trigger. Seeing the actual funnel with their own eyes, hearing a broadcaster break into wall-to-wall coverage and beg them to take cover right now, or hearing a second round of sirens that sounded again about 20 minutes after the warning went out, that finally cut through the fog of familiarity and told people this was not a drill. For some, that second siren was the thing that saved them. And for others, it very nearly did the opposite. One woman told the team she had heard the first siren, turned on her TV, and only gathered her daughters into the bathroom when the broadcast told her to. Then the second siren sounded, and she thought it might be an all clear. She very nearly walked her children out of that bathroom and back into the house in the last seconds before the tornado tore the house apart around them. That is how thin the margin was. That is how much the story we tell ourselves about a sound can decide whether we live. Sit with what that means, because it's the whole heart of this. The warning was not the problem. The lead time was not the problem. The failure, if you can even call it that, was that a perfect message was being delivered to human beings who had every reason, based on their own experience, to distrust it. You can build the best warning system on Earth, and it will not save a single life if the person on the other end has quietly decided the alarm is lying. Issuing the warning was never the hard part. Being believed was. And that realization, that the last and most fragile link in the whole chain was not a machine but a person, is what changed how America warns people permanently. Because the men and women who study these storms could have looked at Joplin and simply blamed the public. They did not. Instead, they did something rare for a scientific agency. They accepted that issuing accurate information was only half the job, and that the other half was human and psychological, and that they had been ignoring it. Out of that came a national effort, launched that very summer, to build what they called a weather-ready nation, an admission that data alone does not keep people alive. Belief does. The most concrete thing to come out of it changed the actual language of the warnings themselves. Before Joplin, a tornado warning was a tornado warning, one flat category, whether the storm was a brief spin-up that might snap a few branches or a mile-wide EF5 aimed at a hospital. There was no way, in the words the system used, to tell you the difference. So the Weather Service built one. They call it impact-based warnings, and the idea is brutally simple. Do not just tell people a tornado is possible. Tell them in plain and escalating language exactly what it is about to do to them. The worst storms now carry tags and phrases held in reserve for the genuine monsters, words like catastrophic, and warnings restructured to spell out the threat and the source, and most importantly, the impact. For the very worst of them, the warning can now say, in effect, this is a life-threatening situation, and you could be killed if you are not underground or in a tornado shelter. Not bureaucratic, not hedged. A sentence engineered to break through exactly the kind of complacency that killed people in Joplin, to reach the person who has heard 100 sirens and needs, in that instant, to understand that this one is different. And in the years that followed, the warning stopped waiting for you to be near a siren or a television at all. It moved into your hand. The push toward alerts that find you wherever you are. The ones that seize your phone and scream at you with that unmistakable tone, targeted to the very ground you're standing on, is part of the same reckoning. The lesson of Joplin was that a warning is worthless if it doesn't reach you and convince you in time. So the country rebuilt its warnings to do both. So here is what this story is really about. Not fear. Fear is easy, and it burns off by morning. It's about the gap, the quiet, deadly gap, between a warning being sent and a warning being believed. Joplin didn't die because the science failed. The science was flawless. Joplin died in the space between the siren and the human heart, in that little private moment where a person decides whether the alarm blaring over their town is real or just the same old noise. 158 people made a reasonable, human, catastrophic bet that this one, like all the others, was nothing. And they were wrong by 17 minutes. The sirens still sound over your town on spring afternoons, the same as they always have. Most of the time, they still mean nothing. That's the trap, and it always will be. But the next time your phone lights up and screams, and you see those blunt capital letters telling you to get underground now, understand where those words came from. They weren't written in an office. They were written in the ruins of a Missouri neighborhood by people who walked that debris and asked the survivors a single unbearable question. What would it have taken to make you move? The answer they got is now built into the warning itself. All you have to do is believe it the first time and not the second. Because the storm, unlike the siren, only ever comes for you once, and it does not wait for you to be sure.